Hello and good afternoon to everyone over here. And thank you, Sanket, for the introduction. As Sanket said, I'm going to present etiology classification of diabetes in today's session. So just to start the topic, this is the classification of diabetes, which has been proposed by ADA and which we all are following over the years since 2014. So broadly speaking, diabetes is divided into four broad categories. That is type 1 diabetes, type 2 diabetes, third is other specific types of diabetes, and the fourth is a gestational diabetes mellitus. So type 1 diabetes can be immune mediated and can be idiopathic also. I hope that last week's session, pathophysiology of type 1 and type 2 diabetes has been discussed with you all, and you are well versed with it now. So the focus of our today's session will be other specific types of diabetes, because gestational diabetes we already had discussed in one of the sessions. So these are the broad classification of diabetes. And if we say the impaired glucose tolerance or the impaired fasting hyperglycemia, so which are the high risk states and which are collectively referred to as the intermediate hyperglycemia, and these are not obviously not included in the classification of diabetes. So as to say, type 2 diabetes, it is ideally a diagnosis of exclusion once all other types of diabetes are excluded, either clinically or biochemically or as and when needed genetically. So as the more specific causes of type of diabetes are found, then these causes will move out of the type 2 patients will move out into the category of other specific types of diabetes as it is found. So this was the broad classification of diabetes, which was proposed by ADA, as I said, type 1, type 2, other specific types, and gestational. But if we see the etiological classification of diabetes, so this has not been proposed by any of the society or the guidelines, but just to understand pathophysiologically, or to better have an idea or to remember etiologic wise. So I have divided diabetes into two categories. As we all know that pancreatic beta cells secrete insulin, and that this insulin acts on the peripheral target organs such as the adipose tissue, skeletal muscle, and liver. So diabetes results either from defective insulin production from the pancreatic beta cells or defective insulin action at these target organs. So these are the two basic etiopathological factors for development of diabetes. Now, which are the causes of either defective beta cell insulin production or defective insulin action? So here I have enumerated. Defective insulin production is either it's due to autoimmune pathologies, genetic factors, or structural pancreatic defects. While defective insulin action can be due to obesity, that is classical type 2 diabetes, antagonistic hormone overproduction, drug induced, and some of the syndromic associations. So what we are going to discuss in today's session uh, is the like I will provide one representative case in each of these categories, and then we will discuss some basic points about that particular category of diabetes, including some of the important MCQ points which may be asked in entrance exams, and some practical pearls also. So first of all, defective insulin production, and the first and foremost category in this particular type of diabetes is the autoimmune, that is called type 1 diabetes. So just to give you a garden variety of type 1 diabetes case, a 27-year-old male, and being diagnosed as a diabetes mellitus at the age of 10 years when he presented with diabetic ketoacidosis. And since then, he has been on insulin, basal bolus regime, and maintaining good glycemic control. So to all of us, we know that this is a classical type 1 diabetes, but how can we confirm that it is a type 1 diabetes? So to confirm a type 1 diabetes, if there is an autoimmune etiology, we can confirm biochemically. So this patient was tested for the GAD65 autoantibody, and the results came positive, and hence it was labeled as a type 1 diabetes. So what are the other autoantibodies, or how can we confirm the type 1 diabetes in these patients? So there are four types of the autoantibodies which are commercially available in today's world. So first and foremost is the GAD65 antibody, islet antigen 2 antibody, anti-insulin antibody, and zinc transporter 8 ZNT8 antibodies. So these are the four antibodies. Practically speaking, these ZNT8 antibodies are commercially very rarely available in our country, while these three antibodies are frequently we can measure in commercial laboratories. So just to remember few points in this particular table, it's not necessary to remember a whole table as such for exam point of view as well as for practical purposes. So what are these tissue specificities of these all autoantibodies in type 1 diabetes? So GAD65 antibody, which is the most commonly used and most commonly measured autoantibody in type 1 diabetes patients. So actually it is not pancreatic specific. GAD65 antigen is expressed in pancreas, in alpha as well as beta cells, in neuronal cells, ovary, testis, as well as in the kidney. So this particular antibody or antigen is not a pancreatic specific antigen, while the islet cell antigen, it is quite specific. It is expressed only in the neuroendocrine cells, while the insulin and ZNT8, these are the beta cell specific antigens only. While if we see the variation with the age, then it is important to remember here that GAD65 antibody detection rate increases with increasing age. Even after the pancreatic beta cells are lost or are exhausted after some years of diabetes diagnosis, these all three antibodies become negative with the loss of beta cells, but GAD65 antibody persists till later, up to third decade of life as well, even up to fourth and fifth decade in some of the patients. So that is why higher detection rate with increasing age is a feature of GAD65 antibody, as well as sometimes with the ZNT antibody. And if the diabetes is diagnosed before 10 years of age, then there is more female preponderance for GAD65 antibody, while there is no such sex preponderance in these three antibodies. So these are the some of the factors to remember. GAD65 is a not pancreatic specific, and detection rate increases with increasing age. And more importantly, the highest sensitivity or the most sensitive antibody is the GAD65 antibody, which is detected in about 80 to 90% of type 1 diabetes patients. While rest of the three antibodies, they are detected in up to 50 to 60% of type 1 diabetes patients only. So most sensitive, most commercially available, easily available, most commonly and most frequently used antibody to confirm type 1 diabetes is GAD65 autoantibody. So this is the point to remember in this particular table. So GAD65, as I said, 70 to 80% of children with new onset type 1 diabetes, they possess this particular autoantibody, while at the same time, about 8% of the type 1 diabetes first degree relatives, they also have positive GAD65 autoantibodies, and some of which they develop type 1 diabetes in near future. So it has some predictive power of predicting type 1 diabetes in earlier stages also. While if we see the general population, it's only 1% of general population can harbor low normal or to like just above the level of normal titers of the GAD65 antibody. So while unlike ICA, that is islet cell antigen or IA2 antibody, GAD65 antibody remains detectable for many years even after the considerable loss of beta cell function. That is why I said that it is the antibody which detection rate increases with increasing age. So this was about antibodies. Now, just to tell you, there are like theoretically, there have been two types of type 1 diabetes, type 1A and type 1B diabetes, if sometimes rarely asked in MCQs. So if antibody is positive, it is type 1A, and in some of the patients, as I said, that 80 to 90% antibody will be positive, but some 20 to 30% will have negative antibodies, but still they have presentation of type 1, just like they have young age of presentation, and they present with ketoacidosis and absolute insulin deficiency, but antibodies are negative. So still they are type 1, but it is labeled as type 1B as a theoretical purposes, where antibody is negative. And in European countries or in the Caucasians, antibody positivity is quite high as compared to our country, or in the Asian and African ethnicities, where antibody predictivity or antibody positivity is not that high as compared to Caucasians. So we encounter type 1B diabetes more often than our Western counterparts. So just as a practical point, type 1A and type 1B diabetes. So this was the autoimmune diabetes. We have not discussed the pathophysiology of the type 1 diabetes, considering in the previous lecture it has been discussed. Now the second factor in the etiological classification of defective pancreatic beta cell insulin production comes the genetic factors. So just to put a small case capsule, she is a 2-year-old girl child, and actually she was diagnosed with diabetes at the age of 2 months, that is in early infantile period, and she had presented with diabetic ketoacidosis. Ultimately, she was recovered, and glycemic control was then attained with the insulin. So we'll come back to this case later on, but basically just to tell you, she is a case of monogenic diabetes. That is, what is monogenic diabetes? So monogenic diabetes results from single gene mutations that cause either beta cell dysfunction or less commonly insulin resistance. So single gene defect in beta cell development or beta cell function, or rarely in insulin resistance gene. So this results in monogenic diabetes. Approximately 1 to 2% of the diabetes is monogenic. but this is frequently misdiagnosed either as type 1 diabetes if it is presented in the young age, or sometimes it as a type 2 diabetes if it is presented in early adulthood or in sometimes in adolescence. So many a times it has been misdiagnosed. Patients are labeled as either type 1 or type 2, but some of these important salient points we should know about these particular cases so that we can rule out, or we can further work up for these monogenic cases of diabetes mellitus. So where should I suspect monogenic diabetes in my patient who has presented in younger age group? So first of all, if diabetes has been diagnosed within the first 6 months of life, it is not type 1 diabetes unless proven otherwise. It is usually monogenic diabetes. We are going to discuss in next slides. Secondly, if the presentation of that diabetes is atypical for the conventional type 1 or type 2 diabetes, if there is an characteristic inheritance pattern. So most commonly monogenic diabetes are known to be inherited in an autosomal dominant pattern, but sometimes they are maternal inherited and sometimes or rarely they can be autosomal recessive. So if you find any of the inheritance pattern like 3-generation family history, which signifies an autosomal dominant familial inheritance, if you identify horizontal transmission, that multiple other siblings are affected in a young age diabetic individual, then you can say it is an autosomal recessive. Or if you can find an inheritance pattern such as maternal uncle has been affected, or one or more maternal uncles have been affected, then it is kind of a maternal inheritance of a type of that particular monogenic diabetes. So if you find any particular inheritance pattern, then you should suspect monogenic diabetes rather than type 1 or type 2. And if there are characteristic features, or especially the extra pancreatic features, which are known to be associated with specific causes of diabetes, of monogenic causes, then they should be suspected. So these are the 4 factors where we can suspect monogenic diabetes and work on it. So first of all, neonatal diabetes amongst the monogenic diabetes. So what is neonatal diabetes? So diabetes diagnosed within 6 months of life. It is most commonly neonatal diabetes and not the type 1 diabetes. Very rare cases of type 1 diabetes, they are diagnosed before 6 months of life, which will be less than 2 to 3% only. So most of the cases of diabetes diagnosed within 6 months. So 6 months is the figure to remember here, because it can be asked in many of the MCQs that neonatal diabetes definition is diabetes diagnosed within 6 months of life. It is actually a very rare disorder, prevalence or incidence being 1 in 1 lakh to 1 in 2 lakh live births. The common presentation of neonatal diabetes is just similar to type 1 diabetes. The patients, they do have absolute insulin deficiency. That is why you do not find detectable C-peptide levels also. And they also usually present with diabetic ketoacidosis and severe dehydration and require insulin as well as fluid therapy, just as type 1 diabetes cases. So commonly can be mistaken or misdiagnosed as type 1 diabetes. Now, important to remember here is 50% of neonatal diabetes is transient neonatal diabetes, TNDM, while other 50% of neonatal diabetes are permanent neonatal diabetes. Now, what is transient and permanent? Permanent neonatal diabetes is easy, that diabetes diagnosed within 6 months and it carries forward and throughout life. While in transient neonatal diabetes, the presentation will be same at baseline. Patient, like at the baseline, clinically or biochemically, we cannot say whether it is transient or permanent. But some of the genetic predictors are there which can help distinguish transient from permanent neonatal diabetes. And these transient cases, diabetes remits at around 3 to 4 years of age, and patients do not require insulin or other medication. And then, again, most of these transient diabetes cases also at around 15 or like in the second decade of life, diabetes usually recurs in approximately 90% of cases. Now, importantly, all the cases of neonatal diabetes are associated with the some or more degrees of the low birth weight or small for gestational age. Now, this is because we know that insulin is a growth promoting factor for the fetus in the intrauterine life, and it is the chief growth promoting factor in the intrauterine life. In up to 1 year of age, there is limited role of growth hormone or IGF-1 as a growth promoting agent. So insulin is the chief or predominant growth promoting agent in the fetus as well as in the infant, and that is why insulin deficiency, which is there from intrauterine life as in neonatal diabetes, can lead to small for gestational age and low birth weight. And the results, this neonatal diabetes results from the mutations of the key genes involved in the beta cell development or function. So in next few slides, we are going to discuss some of the important genes or genetic factors which are responsible for neonatal diabetes. So bear with these slides. There will be some bombarding of the different genes which are associated with neonatal diabetes, but actually they are worth remembering. especially from MCQ point of view. So I will not go into such of details of this, but whatever important from practical and MCQ point of view, that we will discuss in these slides. So first of all, the most common cause of the neonatal diabetes is the mutation in the ATP sensitive potassium channel. Now this ATP sensitive potassium channel actually consists of these two subunits. Also these are important to remember, KCNJ11 and ABCC8. So these are the two genes which encode for the two components of ATP sensitive potassium channel. Now 50% of cases of these particular ATP sensitive potassium channel mutation, they result in permanent neonatal diabetes, and the rest result in transient neonatal diabetes. Now just to understand the basic pathophysiology, I'm sure you all must be knowing this insulin secretion pathway. So just to revise this particular pathway, this is a pancreatic beta cell. As the glucose from extracellular space or from the vascular space enters into the pancreatic beta cell via GLUT2, and this glucokinase here is the enzyme which converts the glucose from the glucose 6-phosphate. So we can say that glucokinase is a glucose sensor of the pancreatic beta cell. It senses glucose and it converts into the glucose 6-phosphate for ATP generation. And now this ATP acts at the level of the ATP sensitive potassium channel. Now conventionally these potassium channels are in open state in most of the times, but when there is glucose entry and there is generation of the ATP via glucokinase into the pancreatic beta cell, this ATP leads to closure of the pancreatic ATP sensitive potassium channels, and that is why potassium is retained into the cell, and it leads to depolarization of the pancreatic beta cell membrane. And now this depolarization reaches the action potential threshold, and it opens up the voltage sensitive calcium channels, and influx of the calcium leads to whatever granules of insulin over here, and it mobilizes these granules, this calcium level mobilizes these granules into the beta cell membrane and release of the insulin into the bloodstream. So this is the glucose mediated insulin secretion from the pancreatic beta cell. So just to understand. Now what is the normal structure of this ATP sensitive potassium channel, because we are discussing neonatal diabetes here. So ATP sensitive potassium channel actually consists of two subunits. So one is the channel itself, and another is this sulfonylurea 1 receptor, which is closely attached to this particular channel. Now here is the receptor where the most of the sulfonylureas get attached, and they actually close the potassium channel and lead to depolarization. Now genetically, to remember this, actually potassium channel is termed as a KIR 6.2, that is potassium inward rectifying channel 6.2, and the gene encoding for this is the KCNJ11, while the sulfonylurea 1 receptor is encoded by a gene called ABCC8, and that is why we will include this ABCC8 and KCNJ11 as a genes responsible for the potassium sensitive ATP channel leading to neonatal diabetes. So back to this particular mutation, that is ATP sensitive potassium channel mutation, both KCNJ11 as well as ABCC8 mutation. As I said, 50% of these cases result in permanent neonatal diabetes. Now because sulfonylureas close the here, sulfonylureas attach over here, and they close the ATP sensitive potassium channel without the need of ATP. So for sulfonylurea, if it is attached here, ATP is not required, glucose is not required to enter the cell and generate ATP for closure of the ATP sensitive potassium channel. And that is why mutations because of this particular ATP sensitive potassium channel, they respond successfully to sulfonylureas as a management tool. And in most of these cases, we can switch from insulin to sulfonylurea as a treatment modality in neonatal diabetes because of this particular mutation. And ATP sensitive potassium channel is also present in some of the other tissues such as nerves and the muscles, and that is why 20% of the patients with KCNJ11 mutation, and sometimes or rarely with ABCC8 mutations, they have associated neurological features which are also important to remember. So what are these features? So as I said, actually KCNJ11 is expressed in neuronal tissues, ABCC8 is very rarely expressed. So 20% of the permanent diabetes associated with KCNJ11 mutation is known to have neurological involvement, and which is known as a mnemonic, that is DEND syndrome. So DEND stands for developmental delay, E for epilepsy, and ND for neonatal diabetes. And sometimes like milder patients or milder mutations, they present with the intermediate DEND syndrome, where developmental delay is actually mild. There is no epilepsy and neonatal diabetes is there. So just to remember that 20% of KCNJ11 mutations, they also have an extra pancreatic features in the form of DEND syndrome, which is developmental delay, epilepsy, and neonatal diabetes. Now, what is the inheritance pattern of this particular KCNJ11 and ABCC8 mutation? So this is just to remember, this is sometimes asked in MCQs. Most of the cases of this particular channel mutation are de novo, spontaneous, or the sporadic inheritance pattern. There is no familial history, or the if you trace the parental genes, you will not find anything. While some of the cases are due to autosomal dominant. So KCNJ11 is typically autosomal dominant, ABCC8 is typically autosomal recessive. But again, majority of these patients are de novo spontaneous mutations. So if you are asked that what is the common inheritance pattern of the potassium ATP channel mutation leading to neonatal diabetes, it is the de novo spontaneous sporadic no inheritance pattern, and which is the most common one. So these are the neurological features of the KCNJ11 mutation. ABCC8 mutation actually results in transient diabetes more than permanent neonatal diabetes, and the neurological features are actually not seen with ABCC8, it is only seen with the KCNJ11. And 90% of patients with this particular ATP potassium channel mutation, they can be switched to sulfonylureas, because as I said, sulfonylurea attachment results in closure of the potassium ATP channel without the need for ATP. So another gene, after looking at the potassium ATP channel, another gene for the neonatal diabetes is the insulin gene, or the INS gene mutation. So heterozygous mutation in insulin gene, they are responsible for approximately 12% cases of permanent neonatal diabetes. So if insulin gene mutation is there, it has to be permanent neonatal diabetes. There is no transient neonatal diabetes reported with insulin gene mutation. While in the previous one, potassium ATP channel, we saw that the 50% were permanent and 50% were transient neonatal diabetes. And here, this insulin gene mutations, they do not respond to oral sulfonylureas or any other treatment. Insulin is the treatment of choice because insulin gene itself is mutated. And just to remember, it is a heterozygous, and that is why it is autosomal dominant in inheritance pattern. While homozygous insulin gene mutations are lethal, the fetus do not survive beyond first trimester, and that is why homozygous insulin gene mutations are not reported, or they are not seen clinically. So insulin gene mutation, 12% of permanent neonatal diabetes, and insulin is the treatment of choice. And the third gene to remember is there is actually a bunch of chromosome. There is a chromosome region 6q24. So just you should remember this particular chromosome number 6q24 because it is the most common cause of transient neonatal diabetes mellitus in approximately 70% of cases. If you want to remember, most common inheritance pattern of this particular chromosome 6q24 mediated is the paternal duplication of the 6q24. So it is inherited in most of the cases, and rarely it is sporadic. So transient neonatal diabetes is usually inherited, while permanent neonatal diabetes due to ATP potassium channel mutation is usually sporadic. 90% of the transient neonatal diabetes, which is not due to 6q24, then you will find these two causes again in transient diabetes as well, that is KCNJ11 and ABCC8. And just to remember, an extrapancreatic features of this chromosome 6q24 related neonatal diabetes, which is usually transient diabetes, are these three features, which are also commonly asked: very low birth weight. So as I said, neonatal diabetes is associated with low birth weight, but 6q24 is associated with extra or very low birth weight, or severe small for gestational age. It is also associated with macroglossia and umbilical hernia. So there are some other genes which are not very important to remember. So that is why I have included only 3 genes to remember. That is potassium channel, ATP channel, that is KCNJ11 and ABCC8 mutation. Just to revise, 50% are permanent and rest are transient. 85% of these potassium channel mutations are spontaneous. There is no inheritance pattern. And the KCNJ11 may associated with the neurological abnormalities, that is developmental delay and epilepsy. And these are sulfonylurea responsive in 90% of cases. If we see the chromosome 6q24 abnormalities, then 70% are transient. So most common cause of transient neonatal diabetes is this particular gene, that is chromosome 6q24 abnormalities. And extrapancreatic features are macroglossia and umbilical hernia. Glucokinase sometimes, very rarely, if it is homozygous inheritance, it is associated with the neonatal diabetes, just to keeping in mind. And other genes are the PTF1, PDX1, insulin gene, and EIF2, AK3, just briefly, they are not that important to remember. So at the end of neonatal diabetes, so the question is, which genes should I test when I come across a diabetes below 6 months of age? So these are the 4 genes. Neonatal diabetes is suspected, and these 4 genes should be tested: chromosome 6q24 abnormalities, KCNJ11, ABCC8, and INS gene. Rest other genes are not necessary to be investigated because it will not give any impact on the treatment or on the impact on the follow-up or on the counseling. So because these 4 genes, chromosome 6q24, if it is there, it will give us the idea that it is going to be transient neonatal diabetes, and it will require insulin. It will not respond to oral drugs. If there is KCNJ11 or ABCC8, 50% will be transient or 50% permanent, and these 2 cases will respond to sulfonylureas. And if we find insulin gene mutation, it is going to be permanent neonatal diabetes, and insulin only will be required. So coming to the first case, which we discussed in previously, this particular young girl diagnosed diabetes at the age of 2 months with diabetic ketoacidosis and was started on insulin. And she was tested for these particular 4 genes of neonatal diabetes, and KCNJ11 heterozygous disease-causing mutation was found. And that is why she was successfully switched to oral glibenclamide. Right from the approximately 9 months to 1 year of age, she was shifted to glibenclamide, and now she is maintaining very good glycemic control with oral glibenclamide without insulin. So this is neonatal diabetes. Now the next case, a 27-year-old female. Actually, she came very recently in the last month only to me. Diagnosed diabetes since last 3 years, but she was not on any treatment because her HbA1c used to be around 7.5 to 8% without any treatment. She was normal weight. There was no sign of insulin resistance such as acanthosis nigricans. And when I inquired about the family history, her father was diagnosed diabetes since his 3rd decade, and he has been on oral anti-diabetic drugs, but other further detail I could not find out. And that is why, considering young age of diabetes, without obesity, without signs of insulin resistance, with the variable or the unknown family history, I ordered a genetic test for the young onset diabetes, and I found this particular mutation, that is HNF1 alpha mutation, and which is known as a MODY3, and which is the most common type of MODY. So that is why she was started on oral sulfonylurea, and the glycemia level is now controlled. So this is a case of MODY, or maturity onset diabetes of young. So few points about the maturity onset diabetes of young, or MODY. So inheritance pattern is autosomal dominant in all the cases of MODY. So that is why in most of the cases you may find 3-generation family history, which is conventionally said to be associated with MODY. But again, practically, it is not always possible to find 3-generation family history in all of these patients, because many of the patients or many of the grandparents or parents, they do not remember or they have not tested for diabetes, and they go on like this only. And rarely it can be sporadic also. But most common inheritance pattern to remember is autosomal dominant, and 3-generation family history is important. Despite young age of onset, that is before 3rd decade or before 30 years of age, these patients are not insulin dependent. If you check for the C-peptide levels, they are not undetectable C-peptides. They have a detectable C-peptide levels. So this is against type 1 diabetes, that although the age of onset is as similar to type 1, but they are not insulin dependent. They will not present with the diabetic ketoacidosis. And it results from mutation on either glucose sensing enzyme, that is glucokinase. As I said in the previous cell pattern, that glucokinase actually senses the intracellular glucose, and it leads to ATP generation from the glucose to glycolysis. So it is due to mutation in the glucose sensing enzyme, that is glucokinase, or one of the transcription factor, which is involved in the beta cell development or function. So that is why, although we are used to remember MODY as MODY 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, or a numerical classification of MODY, but what is most commonly suggested is to divide MODY into these broad categories, either glucokinase MODY or transcription factor MODY. So these are the 2 major maturity onset diabetes of young, or MODY, that is glucokinase MODY and transcription factor MODY. These are the very rare ones, that is insulin gene mutation or cholesterol ester lipase mutation, or MODY X contributes to approximately 10%. So MODY X is actually unknown genes which lead to autosomal dominant inheritance pattern of this young onset diabetes. So just to remember, 2 broad categories of MODY are glucokinase MODY and a transcription factor MODY. And which are these transcription factors? So HNF1 alpha, HNF4 alpha, HNF1 beta, IPF1, and NeuroD1. So these are the classical transcription factors which are involved in beta cell development and beta cell function. And this is the most common MODY also, transcription factors. And again, HNF1 alpha contributes to approximately 60% of cases of MODY. while glucokinase MODY contributes to 22%. So if we numerically classify MODY 1 to 7, MODY 1 is HNF4 alpha, MODY 2 is glucokinase MODY, 3 is 1 alpha, MODY 4 is IPF1, MODY 5 is HNF1 beta, MODY 6 is NeuroD1, and MODY 7 is CEL, that is cholesterol ester lipase. So these are the most commonly identified MODY variants, although there are some variantly identified genes up to MODY 13 they have classified, but they have not yet been accepted by multiple international societies. So that is why up to MODY 7 has been known worldwide. So just to remember, which is the most common maturity onset diabetes of young? So it is MODY 3, which is HNF1 alpha, which is most common, followed by MODY X, that is unknown gene, then MODY 2, that is the HNF, that is glucokinase MODY, and MODY 1, that is HNF4 alpha. It is approximately 2% of cases. And these last three, that is the 4, 5, 6, 7, they are very rare, less than 1% of cases. So most common MODY to remember is HNF1 alpha, or MODY 3 is the most common maturity onset diabetes of young. That is the MCQ point. Now, as I said, the two broad categories of MODY, that is glucokinase MODY and transcription factor MODY. Why it is important to differentiate these particular monogenic diabetes into two broad categories? Because all the transcription factor MODY, they behave similarly in terms of clinical profile, in terms of biochemistry, and in terms of management also. While glucokinase MODY, it behaves differently from this particular category, and we will see the differences between these two, glucokinase and transcription factor. So onset of hyperglycemia, as in glucokinase MODY. So just again, just to remind you, glucokinase MODY here is autosomal dominant, because all MODY, as I said, they are autosomal dominant. While if it is autosomal recessive or homozygous mutation, it results in neonatal diabetes in previous one. So here it is autosomal dominant, heterozygous mutation in glucokinase. So the onset of hyperglycemia in this glucokinase MODY is since birth, while in the transcription factor MODY, the onset of hyperglycemia or diabetes is either in the adolescence or in the early adulthood, with approximately 99% diagnosed before 35 years of age. Presentation, glucokinase MODY, usually it is asymptomatic. Patients are usually diagnosed when they are screened or when they are routinely evaluated for some of the other thing, when they are being operated for some of the surgeries. And at the preoperative evaluation, many a times we find high fasting plasma glucose, and that is why, which leads to familial evaluation, and sometimes they lead to diagnosis of glucokinase MODY. So they are asymptomatic throughout life, and they are detected on routine testing or on the screening tests only. While the transcription factor MODY, they are symptomatic because they can be associated with the significant hyperglycemias. Nature of hyperglycemia. So as I said, glucokinase MODY is associated with the fasting hyperglycemia. So fasting glucose will be between 100 to 144 usually, and HbA1c is just above the upper limit of normal. While the transcription factor MODY, it can be variable from mild to severe hyperglycemia, and HbA1c again depends on the level of the severity of hyperglycemia, from 7% to 12%, 13%, just similar to type 1 diabetes also. So level of hyperglycemia in transcription factor MODY can be variable, can be as high as type 1 diabetes, while in the glucokinase MODY is just mild fasting hyperglycemia only. Now, what is the natural history of hyperglycemia in these two types of the MODY? So it is graphically represented here. So if we see the fasting glucose patterns throughout life, so there is quite stable fasting glucose in a non-diabetic individual. It is in millimole per liter, so that is up to 100 milligram per deciliter. So if we see the glucokinase MODY, so what happens in glucokinase MODY? Glucokinase, as I said, it is a glucose sensing enzyme in the pancreatic beta cell. So if it is mutated, it leads to like it shifts the glucose sensing threshold of the pancreatic beta cell to a higher level. So glucose threshold has been shifted, but it will not progress throughout life. So throughout life, that particular fasting hyperglycemia will be maintained, and it will not result in the significant postprandial hyperglycemia. While the transcription factor MODY is associated with variable, maybe severe hyperglycemia, and it progresses with time, and beta cell deterioration is also expected with time in the transcription factor MODY, just similar to type 1 or type 2 diabetes mellitus. Now, if you see the pattern of glucose tolerance test in between these two types of the MODY, that is glucokinase MODY and transcription factor MODY. So as I said, fasting hyperglycemia and glucokinase, fasting more than 100. And if we see the difference between the 2 hour post glucose minus fasting glucose, it will be less than 100, because postprandial or the post glucose load glycemic values will be not that high in this glucokinase MODY. while in the transcription factor MODY, the postprandial glucose values or the post-glucose load glucose values will be very high. And that is why the difference between the 2 hours PG minus fasting plasma glucose will be more than 100. So this is the pattern of oral glucose tolerance test. Microvascular complications are very rare in glucokinase MODY because it does not progress with time. It is just associated with the mildly elevated HbA1c, and which will be there, it will not progress. While the transcription factor MODY is just similar to type 1 or type 2 diabetes, according to the glycemic profile and the glycemic control over the years, they can be associated with the frequent microvascular complications. Extra pancreatic manifestations, glucokinase MODY is associated with low birth weight because of the low insulin secretion, while the transcription factor MODY, extra pancreatic manifestations, we will see in next table. And if we see the treatment, actually glucokinase MODY does not require any treatment because the threshold only has been set on the higher level for the pancreatic beta cell. So in this particular glucokinase MODY, if you treat with insulin, and if you put the fasting glucose below 100, they will experience hypoglycemic symptoms because the pancreas, the beta cell senses glucose in a slightly different way. So that is why, and because they are not associated with the microvascular or macrovascular complications. So treatment in the glucokinase MODY cases are not recommended. Only in the pregnancy, insulin treatment is required in glucokinase MODY. While in the transcription factor MODY, usually they respond to sulfonylureas for many years together, and then at the end, when the pancreatic beta cells are exhausted, insulin may be required for the treatment of transcription factor MODY. So just to enumerate extra pancreatic manifestations of various types of the transcription factor MODY. So these are important from MCQ point of view. HNF1 alpha, that is MODY3, or the most common type of MODY, is associated with the low renal threshold for glucose. So these patients commonly are found to have glycosuria. So even at the normal levels of the glucose, if we say that glucose threshold for renal tubule is 180 milligram per deciliter, but in these cases, even before the diabetes diagnosis, with the normoglycemia also, these patients are known to excrete glucose in the urine, so they have glycosuria. Secondly, they have high HDL cholesterol levels despite there are no other metabolic syndrome manifestations. Even at normal body weight and normal waist circumference, they have high HDL cholesterol. And despite high HDL cholesterol, which is a good cholesterol, they have a significantly increased cardiovascular risk, and which is the mechanism of which is unknown. And this particularly increased cardiovascular risk is beyond that is there for type 2 diabetes mellitus. And that is why it has been recommended that patients with the HNF1 alpha MODY or the MODY3, if they are more than 40 years of age, they should be started on statin and aspirin, irrespective of other risk factors. The second is HNF4 alpha, that is MODY1. It is associated with the increased birth weight, to the contrary of the most of the neonatal diabetes and the glucokinase MODY. So high birth weight or macrosomia is associated in the HNF4 alpha. And it is also associated with the low HDL cholesterol, low lipoprotein A1, A2, and high LDL cholesterol. So these are the extra pancreatic features of the MODY1. And MODY5, that is HNF1 beta, it is also known as the renal cyst associated diabetes. So as the name itself suggests, it is associated with the renal cysts, sometimes renal agenesis, and other renal developmental disorders, including the glomerulosclerosis. Sometimes also it is associated with the hyperuricemia and the gout as well. So these are the extra pancreatic manifestations to remember for MCQ point of view for various kinds of transcription factor MODY. So I think this is all about the maturity onset diabetes of young, or the MODY gene. The next in category of a genetic defect in the defective insulin production from the pancreatic beta cell is the maternally inherited diabetes and deafness, which is known as MIDD. So it is also known as commonly mitochondrial diabetes mellitus. It is due to mutation in the mitochondrial DNA. And this particular mutation, M3243A2G mutation, this is worth remembering because this is the only mutation which is identified in mitochondrial DNA, which has led to development of MIDD, or the maternal inherited diabetes and deafness. So approximately 85% of the mutation carriers of this particular mutation carriers will develop diabetes, and 75% of this mutation carrier will develop sensory neural hearing loss. And the mean age of diabetes diagnosis is 37 years for this mitochondrial diabetes. Although in early stages, these mitochondrial diabetes also responds to oral sulfonylureas, but it will rapidly progress to insulin requiring diabetes mellitus. So within next 5 years, they respond to sulfonylureas, not more than 5 years duration, and they'll ultimately require insulin treatment. So this is mitochondrial diabetes. What are the extra pancreatic features of mitochondrial diabetes? It is important to remember. So diabetes and deafness, it is there in name itself. So MIDD. Other features are the pigmentary retinopathy, cardiomyopathy, constipation because of the agenesis of the ganglions in the distal colon, then myopathy and nephropathy, that is the focal segmental glomerulosclerosis. So these are the extra pancreatic features. If they are found in any of the patients, then it is worth considering analysis for the genetics of the or the mitochondrial DNA mutation. So pigmentary retinopathy, cardiomyopathy, myopathy, constipation, and FSGS, along with diabetes and deafness, which all this symptom complex contributes to maternally inherited diabetes and deafness. So this is MIDD. The next gene or the next case I would like to discuss, a 20-year-old male born of consanguineous marriage. Now he was diagnosed diabetes mellitus and was put on insulin since the age of 3 years. So which makes it more commonly a type 1 diabetes kind of things. And he also had presented with the diabetic ketoacidosis only. But then the course was changed when at the age of 10 years he presented with the gradually decreasing vision, and on bilateral ophthalmic examination it was found to have a bilateral optic atrophy. Further on, at the age of 12 years, he was diagnosed with diabetes insipidus when he was having continuously increased polyuria and polydipsia despite controlled glycemic status. So then he was tested with the urine and serum osmolality and sodium levels, and he was found to have a diabetes insipidus. And at the age of 12 years, he was diagnosed with the hearing loss, that is sensory neural hearing loss. And in the family history, there were two other siblings which were similarly affected. At the age of 5 years, one of the sibling was diagnosed with diabetes mellitus, and the other sibling was diagnosed diabetes at the age of 3 years itself. So this is a classical. If we see this particular family history in multiple siblings, then it is very rarely a type 1 diabetes. So this is one clenching point, that family history of young onset diabetes is rarely type 1 diabetes, because type 1 is rarely associated with that similar presentation in sibling itself. So this particular patient was tested for the mutation, and it was found Wolframin gene mutation or WFS1 gene mutation, and it is called Wolfram syndrome or a DID-MOD syndrome. So it is easy to remember. DID-MOD syndrome is an acronym. DI stands for diabetes insipidus, DM stands for diabetes mellitus, OA for optic atrophy, and D for deafness. So it is also known as a DID-MOD syndrome in some of the literature, just as an ease of remembering. And conventionally, it has been known as a Wolfram syndrome from the name of Wolframin gene mutation. So this is the presentation or classical presentation for this Wolfram syndrome or DID-MOD syndrome. So just collectively, what are the pancreatic beta cell genetic defects? Just to revise, we saw that mutation in the either KCNJ11 or ABCC8 among other genes leads to neonatal diabetes, and where the diabetes is diagnosed before 6 months of life in a patient, and they present with the absolute insulin deficiency and diabetic ketoacidosis. Secondly, we saw the presentation of mitochondrial diabetes because of mutation in the mitochondrial DNA, typically M3243A2G mutation, to remember, as a cause of MIDD, that is maternally inherited diabetes and deafness. Thirdly, it is a MODY genes mutation in either glucokinase, that is glucose sensing enzyme in the pancreatic cell, or the transcription factor associated in the beta cell development leads to MODY, that is maturity onset diabetes of young. And lastly, mutation in the endoplasmic reticulum, which abnormally places the patients or the beta cells at higher stress of the free radicals, and that leads to Wolfram syndrome or DID-MOD syndrome. So endoplasmic reticulum mutation in WFS gene, DID-MOD syndrome. So these are the multiple genes which are associated with the defective insulin production from the pancreatic beta cells or defective pancreatic beta cell development, and ultimately diabetes or monogenic diabetes. So just as a how to approach to a clinical subtype of a monogenic diabetes or a beta cell specific monogenic diabetes. So if the diabetes is diagnosed before 6 months of age, it can be either transient or permanent neonatal diabetes. If it is permanent neonatal diabetes, as I said, KCNJ11 and ABCC8 are the most common mutations, and they respond to oral sulfonylurea if it is found. If these are negative in permanent diabetes, then it should be either insulin gene mutation or glucokinase mutation, and the treatment of choice is insulin here. In the case of transient neonatal diabetes, as I said, the most common cause is chromosome 6q24 region of that particular and multiple genes associated with it. And transient diabetes, insulin is the treatment of choice. They will not respond to oral sulfonylureas unless KCNJ11 or ABCC8 mutations are found. So this is about neonatal diabetes. If there is suspicion of monogenic diabetes and only there is familial mild fasting hyperglycemia with normal postprandial glucose and just borderline elevated HbA1c and which is non-progressive, then it is clearly glucokinase mutation or glucokinase MODY, and they do not require treatment. Only in pregnancy they require insulin treatment. While if there is familial young onset diabetes and which is about progressive or associated with the variable maybe severe hyperglycemia, then we should test for transcription factors, that is commonly HNF1 alpha MODY3 or HNF4 alpha, that is MODY1, and they respond to oral sulfonylureas. And some of the diabetes which is an extra pancreatic feature. So as I said earlier, that when should I suspect monogenic diabetes? So one of the point was that if there are extra pancreatic features which are known to be associated with this some syndromes, then we should consider monogenic diabetes into a differential and should work for it. So what are these diabetes with extra pancreatic features? We already saw, just to revise, renal cyst, extra pancreatic, exocrine pancreatic insufficiency and genitourinary abnormalities are associated with RCAD syndrome or HNF1 beta, which is also known as MODY5, and early insulin therapy is the treatment of choice. If there is sensory neural hearing loss with diabetes, with maternal diabetes and deafness, it is MIDD, short stature, pigmentary retinopathy, cardiomyopathy, myopathy, then test for the 3243 mitochondrial DNA mutation. And although they respond to sulfonylurea initially, but ultimately they progress to rapid insulin requirement. If there are features of the Didmore syndrome, that is diabetes mellitus, diabetes insipidus, optic atrophy, and deafness, and especially the family history of autosomal recessive inheritance pattern, test for the Wolfram syndrome gene, WFS gene, and insulin is the treatment of choice. And rarely there is thiamine responsive megaloblastic anemia. So where patients may have diabetes, deafness, megaloblastic anemia, cardiac abnormalities, and neurological abnormalities, and mutation in the SLC19A2 gene. Just to remember, thiamine responsive megaloblastic anemia is a kind of monogenic diabetes. So this was about the monogenic diabetes in the pancreatic beta cell insulin defective production. Now, what third category is the structural defects in the pancreas. So it neither autoimmune nor genetic, but still there is defective insulin production. So there can be structural pancreatic lesions. So just a case capsule, this particular 38-year-old gentleman, but being chronic alcoholic since or heavy alcoholic since last 20 years and has been diagnosed with diabetes in since last 2 years only. Recurrent pain abdomen is there, which is colicky kind of pain abdomen in the epigastric region. And it is also associated with the loose oily stools to signify steatorrhea. And when he was imaged here, you can see that multiple small calcifications throughout the body and the tail of pancreas. So it is typically alcoholic chronic calcific pancreatitis. Now this chronic calcific pancreatitis has actually led to the resolution or the dissolution of the pancreatic parenchyma, exocrine as well as endocrine tissue. And this particular patients, they have exocrine insufficiency as well as diabetes mellitus. Similar presentation was there in this young lady of 30-year-old, and she also had a history of recurrent pain abdomen since the adolescence age group. She also had history of steatorrhea or the fat malabsorption, and she was recently diagnosed with diabetes. But to the contrary of previous patients, she was not alcoholic. And when imaging was done, here you can see that chunky calcifications in the head of the pancreas or in the pancreatic duct predominantly, while there were no significant calcifications in the tail of the pancreas or in the body of the pancreas. So predominantly ductal calcification and a big chunky calcification. And this particular category is termed as a fibrocalculous pancreatic disease or fibrocalculous pancreatic diabetes or tropical diabetes or malnutrition related diabetes. Now there are some MCQs asked in this particular category also. And this is also not very rare kind of a diabetes, because in last 1 year only, I have come across around 7 or 8 patients of fibrocalculous pancreatic diabetes, which were earlier being labeled as a type 1 diabetes, and they were continued on insulin. So why it is important to diagnose this particular entity? Because these patients, along with insulin, they will require pancreatic enzyme supplements for normal fat and protein digestion, Otherwise, they will go on to develop malnutrition related issues. So what is the fibrocalculous pancreatic disease, or tropical diabetes, or malnutrition related diabetes? So basically it was first time diagnosed in Indonesia, and then recently in India also there have been a lot of literature on this particular entity from Tamil Nadu and from Kerala, where these are the two states where there is a highest incidence of fibrocalculous pancreatic disease has been found. So basically earlier it was thought that it is related to poor nutrition because it was found in the poor socioeconomic strata. But then this particular theory of poor nutrition as an etiologic factor was not accepted very well. Later came the role of dietary toxins, especially cyanogens in the cassava and all other foods. But this hypothesis also could not stand with time. And there were some there are multiple family members also which were affected with the same disease, that is fibrocalculous pancreatic disease, and that is why they were tested for the various on genome-wide association study, this PINK1 gene mutation was found. And as of now, this is the most commonly accepted hypothesis for the etiology of the FCPD or fibrocalculous pancreatic disease. So just you should remember only one gene name, that is PINK1, which is associated with the FCPD. And this FCPD is more commonly or the highest incidence is in the Tamil Nadu and Kerala states of India. It is not seen in the Western literature, and that is why I think hardly you will come across this particular entity in Harrison or in the our common textbooks. So what is the natural history of this particular FCPD or the tropical diabetes? So because there is structural pancreatic damage. So just before going on to this, I would like to mention one point, that in difference between the alcoholic pancreatitis and FCPD here is that in alcoholic pancreatitis, these calcifications will be throughout the body and tail of pancreatic parenchyma, and these will be small calcifications. While in the FCPD, there will be a big chunky calcification, and predominantly in the head and in the pancreatic duct, and there will be no family history. And the rest of the differences we will see in some slides. So PINK1 gene mutation is responsible for it. So natural history is that patients usually have recurrent pain abdomen or colicky pain abdomen from the early childhood, that is from the first decade itself, which will progress to steatorrhea or the fat malabsorption, and the other signs of malabsorption in the second decade. And the diabetes usually develops in the third decade or in the late second decade of the life. So when there is diabetes associated, it is commonly termed as FCPD. And when there is less of a diabetes or more of an impaired glucose tolerance, but predominantly steatorrhea and calcification and abdominal pain, then it is labeled as tropical calcific pancreatitis. So what are the differences between the tropical calcific pancreatitis or FCPD versus alcoholic chronic pancreatitis? So because alcoholic chronic pancreatitis is more common in the males, 90:10, but this tropical, although it is more common in males, but the ratio is slightly less. Male is to female ratio is 70:30. And the peak age of onset of FCPD or diagnosis of diabetes is 20 to 30 years. That is early onset of diabetes and early age of onset in FCPD as compared to alcoholic chronic pancreatitis. And the other factors to remember here are that, as I said, that pancreatic calculi will be more larger and more frequent in the tropical pancreatitis as compared to they will be smaller and less frequent in the alcoholic chronic pancreatitis. But most important factor to remember for MCQ is that FCPD is associated with the markedly elevated risk of pancreatic carcinoma. While although alcoholic pancreatitis, they also do have an increased risk of pancreatic carcinoma, but that risk is exponentially or substantially high in the FCPD or in the tropical pancreatitis. And the prevalence of diabetes is significantly high, approximately 90% in the FCPD or in the tropical pancreatic diabetes, while in the alcoholic pancreatitis, 50% of them will not have diabetes, although they have malabsorption and other exocrine pancreatic insufficiency. So these are the structural defects in the pancreatic parenchyma leading to diabetes. So now moving on to from defective insulin production. So now we are going into the next part, that is the defective insulin action or insulin resistance. So obesity, as we all know, that we will not go into detail of this particular case. Obesity has been responsible for the pandemic of type 2 diabetes, and it is the predominant factor for development of type 2 diabetes, as in like we are seeing such cases day in and day out. 58-year-old male, diabetic since last 2 years, and we can see here the acanthosis nigricans over the neck, which is the important sign to observe in many of the patients. When even you can see this sign in the normal glycemic status or in the pre-diabetic state also. and the BMI being 31.5 kilogram per meter square and A1C of 7.7. So classical type 2 diabetes. So nothing much to discuss about this particular type 2 diabetes. So the next category in the defective insulin action are the overproduction of the antagonistic hormones. So which are these antagonistic hormone overproduction which leads to diabetes mellitus? So first of all, overproduction of growth hormone, as in the case of acromegaly. So this particular case I remember in my DM residency. He was actually following somewhere else for since long duration for type 2 diabetes only. But when he was recognized to have by some of our residents that there were subtle features of acromegaly, then he was tested for the growth hormone and IGF-1, and it was found that growth hormone overproduction and pituitary adenoma. So it is a case of acromegaly or a growth hormone overproduction leading to type 2 diabetes mellitus. So as an antagonistic hormone which acts against insulin or leads to insulin resistance. So now what is the pathophysiology or the mechanism of action or the mechanism of development of diabetes because of growth hormone overproduction? So for these are the normal physiology of the insulin secretion and normal physiology of insulin action at the target cell. This is a skeletal muscle cell. So this we all know that insulin goes ATP sensitive potassium channel, like glucose enters into the cell, potassium channel closes, leads to depolarization, opening of the calcium channel, influx of the calcium, and these insulin granules, they move onto the surface and insulin is secreted. While what happens in the presence of insulin when it acts on the target cell, that is, say for example on the skeletal muscle cell, attachment of the insulin to insulin receptor leads to mobilization of the GLUT4 vesicles from intracellular to the surface of the cell. And now these GLUT4 are the channels through which the glucose is utilized from the bloodstream into the skeletal muscle. And then insulin also acts on the multiple insulin signaling pathways for this particular mechanism. So these are the common mechanism of action of insulin secretion and insulin action. So what does the growth hormone excess lead to? So growth hormone excess leads to diabetes because of the predominant mechanism is growth hormone leads to increased lipolysis at the level of adipose tissue, and increased lipolysis results in increased availability of the non-esterified fatty acids. So those excess non-esterified fatty acids lead to increase in glucotoxicity, and they directly prevent the insulin secretion from the pancreatic beta cell. So this is the predominant pathophysiological factor development of growth hormone induced diabetes in acromegaly patients. And less commonly, growth hormone leads to activation of the SOX. Now this is also an MCQ point, that growth hormone leads to activation of SOX. SOX stands for suppressor of cytokine signaling, and this activation of the SOX gene leads to resistance at the level of the insulin signaling pathways, and that is why insulin resistance. So that is why acromegaly is known to reduce the insulin secretion as well predominantly, while to some extent it also leads to insulin resistance via activation of the SOX, that is suppressor of cytokine signaling. So another of the antagonistic hormone after growth hormone, that is cortisol overproduction, as in the case of pituitary macroadenoma leading to ACTH overproduction and high ODS and LDDS cortisol. This is case of Cushing's disease. And how cortisol overproduction acts as an antagonistic hormone to lead to diabetes mellitus. So the thickness of the line represents the predominant mechanism of action. So the cortisol overproduction, the predominant mechanism of diabetes development in Cushing's disease is that cortisol directly suppresses the genes which are known to express the GLUT4 vesicles. So that is why directly suppresses the GLUT4 vesicles, and these GLUT4 vesicles are not able to move into the cell surface, and that is why the cell is not able, like glucose is not able to enter in from bloodstream into the cell. So predominantly cortisol leads to increased insulin resistance via suppressing the genes responsible for the moving of GLUT4 vesicles. Another mechanism is that Cushing's disease is associated with hypokalemia in most of the cases, and the hypokalemia leads to inability of the potassium sensitive ATP channel to close, and that is why potassium moves out of the cell and depolarization is not properly occurs, and it leads to defective insulin secretion. And lastly, cortisol has some property of directly suppressing insulin secretion from the pancreatic beta cell. So if you are asked that predominant mechanism of action or predominant mechanism of development of diabetes in the Cushing's disease or excess hypercortisolemia is that insulin resistance at the level of the skeletal muscles, then the pancreatic beta cell insulin secretion. Third is the overproduction of the catecholamines, as in the case of pheochromocytoma. So we can see that plasma free metanephrine and normetanephrines are elevated, and in this particular case of pheochromocytoma, and how these catecholamine excess leads to development of type 2 diabetes mellitus, or not type 2 diabetes, it's an hormone related diabetes mellitus. So predominant mechanism is here, catecholamines lead to activation of the alpha 2 receptors, and now excess activation of the alpha 2 receptors leads to defective insulin release from the pancreatic beta cells, while the excessive activation of the beta 2 adrenoreceptors, it leads to increased glycolysis and increased lipolysis in the muscle as well as in the adipose tissue, and that is why increased availability of the lactate and non-esterified fatty acids. Now again, lactate and non-esterified fatty acids are the substrates for the gluconeogenesis, so it leads to hyperglycemia. So the catecholamine induced diabetes predominant mechanism of action is alpha 2 receptor mediated suppression of insulin secretion, and this second is the beta 2 receptor mediated increase in the gluconeogenesis. And lastly, antagonistic hormone overproduction. We all know, as in the case of gestational diabetes mellitus, because of the overproduction of the pancreatic hormones. Just to revise, which are these pancreatic hormones which are known to increase the insulin resistance in the third trimester of the pregnancy and lead to gestational diabetes mellitus. So these are human placental lactogen, progesterone, human chorionic somatotropin, or the placental growth hormone. So these are the placental hormones which are responsible for the increasing insulin resistance in the third trimester of pregnancy and responsible for development of gestational diabetes. So other endocrinopathies and diabetes, we are not going into details of mechanism of caused by these endocrinopathies. Just to enumerate causes of endocrinopathies leading to diabetes mellitus are just organ-wise: pituitary, Cushing's disease, acromegaly due to growth hormone excess, and prolactinoma due to prolactin excess. And thyroid, hyperthyroidism can be associated with the diabetes because of the hyperthyroidism is associated with increased clearance of the endogenous insulin and some of the action at the insulin resist or in the target organ levels also. So hyperthyroidism is associated with increased insulin clearance and the development of diabetes mellitus. Hyperparathyroidism is also known to be associated with diabetes mellitus, and in the adrenal, pheochromocytoma and aldosteronoma or the Cohn syndrome. While if we see the pancreatic tumors, that is glucagonoma, somatostatinoma, gastrinoma, and after surgery of insulinoma. So these are the endocrinopathies and diabetes mellitus, just to enumerate and just to remember the names of these particular illnesses as a cause of endocrinopathies or the antagonistic hormone overproduction and diabetes. Now, what is more important here to remember? So I have made one diagram here to remember as an MCQ point of view, that how should I suspect these particular cases or endocrinopathies in a routine diabetic patient when he is visiting my OPD. So we should have a high index of clinical suspicion. As I said in the earlier acromegaly patient, that if we suspect that there is some enlargement of the extremities or some enlargement of the lips and the nose, and if we are suspecting acromegaly, then we should screen for it. And what are the screening tests of choice? So these are very important from MCQ point of view, that what are the screening tests of choice for these particular endocrinopathies. So only one test as a screening test. So Cushing syndrome, if we are suspecting, then ODS cortisol, that is overnight dexamethasone suppressed cortisol, is the screening test of choice for confirming endogenous Cushing syndrome, not for exogenous Cushing syndrome. So just remember ODS cortisol or overnight dexamethasone suppressed cortisol for a screening test of Cushing syndrome. If we are suspecting acromegaly, the screening test of choice is the serum IGF-1 and not the serum growth hormone or the glucose suppressed growth hormone. If you are suspecting prolactinoma, then serum prolactin or random serum prolactin and not the pooled serum prolactin for screening of prolactinoma. For hyperthyroidism, it is screening test of choice is serum TSH and not isolated T3 and T4 or free T3 and free T4. For diagnosis of hyperparathyroidism, the screening test of choice are this serum calcium and serum phosphorus and not the serum PTH levels, because serum PTH can be elevated in secondary hyperparathyroidism as well, and it does not confirm the primary hyperparathyroidism. So screening test of choice for hyperparathyroidism are the serum calcium and phosphorus and not the PTH. And for pheochromocytoma, the screening test of choice are the serum or the plasma free normetanephrine levels. And here, not the serum or plasma catecholamines, not the urinary catecholamines, or not the urinary VMA levels. So if you are asked the screening test of choice for pheo, it is the plasma free normetanephrine level. So these are the endocrinopathies and diabetes. While for aldosteronoma, it is the PAC by PRA ratio, that is plasma aldosterone concentration divided by plasma renin activity or the direct renin levels. So these are the screening tests for various endocrinopathies associated with the diabetes mellitus. Pancreatic tumors are very rare, and for rare disease, there cannot be any consensus as a screening test of choice. So after looking at the antagonistic hormone overproduction as a cause of diabetes mellitus, next is the drug induced. So we know that many of the drugs which we are using very commonly may be associated with the increased insulin resistance or defective insulin production, and they lead to drug induced diabetes. So just I have written few examples of drugs leading to development of diabetes. So to categorize the drugs which are known to decrease the insulin secretion, or the drugs which are known to increase the insulin resistance, or they are acting at the level of defective insulin action. So if we see the decrease in the insulin secretion, they can be beta cell toxins such as the streptozotocin or the pentamidine. Thiazide diuretics, they are also known to decrease the insulin secretion, predominantly via leading to reduction in the ambient serum potassium levels. Diazoxide also reduces the insulin secretion, and the somatostatin and octreotides, they suppress the insulin secretion, while the insulin resistance is increased by these particular drugs, that is predominantly glucocorticoids. In various combinations and in various routes of administration, they can lead to development of diabetes. Oral contraceptive pills, especially the high dose estradiol and progesterone, that is levonorgestrel, glucagon, growth hormone, and thiazide. And some of the other drugs such as the antiretroviral agents such as known to lead to development of lipodystrophies and development of diabetes, which I have forgot to mention here. And some of the antibiotics also such as fluoroquinolones. So these are the drugs leading to drug-induced diabetes mellitus. And lastly, the defective insulin action has been found as an association of some of these syndromes which are very rare in practice, but they are worth mentioning. Not very rare, some of these syndromes are even very common, but here predominant mechanism of development of diabetes is the defective insulin action or predominant insulin resistance rather than the defective insulin production. That is why we have not included these genes into the monogenic diabetes cases. So to give you an examples, Prader-Willi syndrome. So Prader-Willi syndrome points to remember are there. Prader-Willi syndrome is due to mutation or the paternal deletion of the chromosome 15 or the maternal duplication of chromosome 15. So this is a catchy point in Prader-Willi syndrome MCQ. So it either paternal deletion or maternal duplication of chromosome 15 is associated with development of Prader-Willi syndrome. And most of the cases, they are not inherited, they are sporadic, de novo, spontaneous mutations, while rarely it can be either autosomal dominant or it can be imprinted, such as maternal transmission also. So predominant inheritance pattern for Prader-Willi is it is not inherited, it is de novo or sporadic. And the predominant cause is the paternal deletion of chromosome 15. Now, what are the features of the Prader-Willi syndrome other than the diabetes where it is associated? So in infancy, these patients, they have severe hypotonia and they have feeding difficulties. While they grow into the childhood, they have excessive appetite. They develop severe or the voracious appetite and hyperphagia. And this continuous hyperphagia leads to morbid obesity. Ultimately, they are short stature and they have cognitive impairment and developmental delay as well as mental retardation. And in the adolescents, they have hypogonadotropic hypogonadism as a common feature, and they have multiple behavioral issues also. So these are some of the predominant features of Prader-Willi syndrome. Another of the syndrome associated with the defective insulin action is the Hare-Ann syndrome. That is due to insulin receptor mutation. So again, a cause of monogenic diabetes, but the monogenic diabetes leading to defective insulin action, not the production. So it is an autosomal recessive in inheritance. Hare-Ann actually is an acronym, stands for hyperandrogenism, insulin resistance, and acanthosis nigricans syndrome. And it is due to mutation in the insulin receptor gene, and it is an autosomal recessive in inheritance. So third syndrome is the Bardet-Biedl syndrome. Earlier it was known as a Lawrence-Moon-Biedl syndrome. So Bardet-Biedl syndrome also is an autosomal recessive gene, and it is also kind of an obesity, hypogonadism, diabetes syndrome. So the salient or some of the important clinical features are the short stature, hypogonadism, polydactyly, retinitis pigmentosa, and developmental delay other than the diabetes and obesity. Next is the Turner syndrome, is also associated with the increased risk of developing diabetes. So Turner syndrome observed in the girls with a karyotypic feature of a 45X or the deletion of the 1X chromosome copy number. So Turner syndrome is not inherited. It is an it is a mosaic finding. So it is developed. It has developed during the aneuploid. It's during the diploidy state of the fetus development. So what are the features or the characteristic features of Turner syndrome? Are short stature in a girl, streak ovaries, and that is why hypergonadotropic hypogonadism and absent puberty. Webbing of the neck, typically because of the lymphatic abnormalities in the neck during the intrauterine life, or sometimes cystic hygroma also. And when they grow, these cystic hygromas or the lymphatic abnormalities, they regress and they lead to fibrotic bends. And these fibrotic bends lead to development of webbing of the neck. Now, because these fibrotic bends, they are also like lymphatic system and cardiovascular system, they have a common embryological origin. And that is why this lymphatic duct or the cystic hygroma regression leads to fibrotic bends, and which are also associated with the cardiovascular abnormalities such as the bicuspid aortic valve, coarctation of aorta, and sometimes dissecting aneurysm of aorta also. Then short fourth metacarpal and metatarsals in some of the patients, we can see in this particular this child also, and rarely lymphedema of the lower limbs. So these are the features of Turner syndrome. And Klinefelter syndrome, hypergonadotropic hypogonadism in males due to excess of the X chromosome, that is 47XXY. This also similar to Turner, it is not inherited. It results in hypergonadotropic hypogonadism because of testicular failure. Because of the extra number of the X chromosome, they are tall, and they have unicoid stature, that is they have a lower segment of body is larger than the upper segment, and arm span is higher than the height of these patients. They have gynecomastia, learning disabilities, and at some point of their life, they are at increased risk of development of germ cell tumors, either in the testis or in the mediastinum or even in the brain. So these are the some syndromic associations of defective insulin action or increased insulin resistance. So to summarize, these are the this is the etiological classification of diabetes mellitus, either defective insulin production or defective insulin action due to multiple factors. And this I have tried to differentiate it from what has been proposed by ADA as a broad classification of diabetes, which we all know: type 1, type 2, other specific types, and gestational diabetes. So I have tried to cover most of the specific types of diabetes into the case capsules and some of the minor details about it. So with this, we'll end here. Thank you.
Yeah, Kunal, so it was brilliant actually. And it is good to know that we think this is not as per just classification, but more for the etiology, because that's how it helps in practice rather than having the types. That's like I can't do this magic with diabetes for sure in my practice. It's good to know that these things exist, and diabetes is something like we should know as a MD in detail, because we are going to get reference of this case. So at least the clue that where we have to suspect the other forms or where the other endocrinopathies are associated or not. So there are few questions from students I will like to ask one by one. So we'll see if we can do justice to that. So first thing is what are the bare minimum things is required to ask and examine in a young diabetic patient, or I will say any diabetic patient. As such, we know that common things, okay, complication related history and all we ask, other than to get a clue that we are not just dealing with type 2 peculiar, something else is there. So in your practice, what you go with that?
So yeah, that's a good question actually. If we are dealing with a young diabetes patient, so young is defined as actually diabetes diagnosis before 30 years of age. So first of all, what is the presentation of diabetes? Whether the patient has presented with absolute insulin deficiency, such as in the state of diabetic ketoacidosis. So if there is diabetic ketoacidosis in a young diabetic patient, it goes more towards type 1 diabetes rather than the other causes of the monogenic diabetes, except in below 6 months of age, as I said, in the neonatal diabetes. So first and foremost important is the presentation of diabetes. It is the diabetic ketoacidosis. Second is the presence of osmotic symptoms. So osmotic symptoms are hyperphagia, polydipsia, and weight loss. So this weight loss is characteristic in patients with the absolute or the severe insulin deficiency. They have typical osmotic symptoms and weight loss, while the patients with the MODY and all other monogenic diabetes, which are milder kinds, they typically do not have osmotic symptoms of the severe hyperglycemia. Third thing obviously is a family history. as I said, that 1 or 2 patients I have caught that they have a sibling associate, they have a young sibling who has developed a similar kind of presentation at the age of around 10 years or 5 years with severe diabetes and diabetic ketoacidosis. And in some of the communities also, when we find that there are consanguineous marriages which are very common, and especially if there is a history of consanguineous marriage in parents and there is a history of young onset diabetes in a sibling, then I would definitely suspect monogenic diabetes, and very rarely it is a type 1 diabetes mellitus. And lastly, it's also important to look for extra pancreatic manifestations also, especially if there are there is myopathy or cardiomyopathy or sensory neural hearing loss, or if there are on imaging, if it has been done for some other reasons and there is finding of some renal developmental disorders or pancreatic agenesis, if it has been found in some of the CT or not. So these are some of the factors which we are. Lastly, many of the young onset, as I said, that one of the pancreatic diabetic patient, that is chronic pancreatitis 1, which was labeled as type 1 diabetes and was started on insulin. So although these young patients, they do require insulin, but like if signs of malnutrition or signs of exocrine pancreatic insufficiency, it is very important to ask in history to all young diabetic individuals, because if we are finding signs of steatorrhea, that is frequent loose sticky stools, and other signs of vitamin malnutrition and overall protein energy malnutrition, then it will point to a diagnosis of exocrine and endocrine pancreatic insufficiency. So where we should replace pancreatic enzymes as well.
Okay, so I think one thing common I can say with like doing DM, one thing what we learn very properly is to make a pedigree chart.
Yeah,
at every patient we are, if pedigree chart is not there as a specialist, mean we are going to miss. It's a kind of a general practice. So I still make for my all the patient, even though I know they are going to be RA, because this multiplex families and common association autoimmunity is very common. So we can make a good diagnosis only we start doing that. So I will try to keep, I have one PPT on pedigree chart itself. So I will try to send to our students. Kunal, the next doubt is, what are the investigation on day 1 or the you send when you have a young diabetes? Like you send TSH for everyone, you do abdominal X-ray for everyone, or like what will be your approach as an endocrinologist when you refer to type 1? Or like, Sanket, I won't say type 1, but young diabetes.
Yeah, actually, I did not got your question. It was like hang. It was.
Okay, fine. Is it clear now?
Yeah, it's clear now. Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, so the question is, on day 1 in young diabetes, what are the investigation you order? Like you order TSH for everyone, abdominal X-ray for everyone. What will be your approach rather than thinking just type 1 or something? What will be your screening test at least to tell?
So typically, as I said, that patient's clinical manifestation not. So I actually do not do antibody tests to confirm diabetes in all my younger diabetic individuals. So the diabetic ketoacidosis in a typical age group without a family history of diabetes, without clinical signs of steatorrhea or malabsorption, I would label it as a type 1 diabetes. And now labeling a type 1 diabetes, I would at baseline will do thyroid profile in all these patients. And in some of the patients, if they are affording, then I will also screen for the celiac disease by just an antibody test, that is IgA tissue transglutaminase antibodies. So these are the two I will do at baseline. If they are negative, ideally to repeat every yearly TSH as well as celiac screening every yearly. So these are the basic tests. I will not do C-peptide or anti-GAD antibody in all the patients, only in doubtful cases where I want to rule out other causes, or I want to consider some other causes into diagnosis, then I will confirm. So in these cases also, because type 1 is the most common, so that is why I will first progress with the anti-GAD antibody. If anti-GAD antibody comes positive, well and good. If it is negative, then I will go to other consideration of diagnosis. That is, I'll go for MODY genetics or the gene panel for the young diabetes. And recently, like commercial laboratories are offering next generation sequencing for diabetes genes, and they are offering approximately 30 or 40 genes in a single panel. So earlier, what used to happen that we used to order a single gene, that you test for MODY3 first, because it is the most common one. If it is negative, then you screen for MODY1 gene or MODY2 gene. and like that. But nowadays, at the same cost, we are getting all the genes at a single shot. So it is easy that after ruling out type 1 diabetes, you can directly order a young diabetes genetic panel and you can get that diagnosis.
Yeah. Now, one question is quite practical that many of the patients cannot afford genetic testing. So, do you have any source in India where we can send sample and with history they might do? In immunology, there are so many people in Mumbai and Chandigarh. They do genetic testing for free if we provide enough history. They will use it for publication. That's okay, but patient
Yeah.
purpose is solved.
So, free of cost genetic testing is in India, it is not available, but CMC Vellore Department of Endocrinology is doing at very low cost as compared to commercial laboratories. So, for
Okay.
young onset diabetes and CMC Vellore at around 5 to 7,000 only, while in the same
Okay.
in the other commercial laboratories, it costs around 15 to 20,000.
Okay. So I think that is important to note that we have to make some context at least when we want to send sample. Otherwise, it is impossible to practice specifically in periphery. And sometimes we have to prove the diagnosis, whatever we say. Now
Yeah,
the one question. Yeah, please go.
and one more thing, that earlier this genetic testing was used to be very costlier when we were using a single gene screening. So as I said, when multiple gene with the next generation sequencing and all, 15,000 is not a big amount. I think
Yeah.
if we want to confirm the monogenic diabetes for sure. So with the easy availability of the genetic screening, the cost has also reduced to a significant amount. So most of the commercial laboratories, they are offering multiple gene screening at 15 to 20,000 only.
Okay. Now one question is with respect to chronic calcific pancreatitis, is there any temporal association? What occurs first, exocrine or endocrine?
So first, there is natural history of this tropical pancreatitis. The calculi develop in the pancreatic ducts. So as the pancreatic ductal calculi size increases, so first of all, exocrine insufficiency develops into the second decade. And so patients may have a history of steatorrhea. They may also not give the history, but the development of steatorrhea and the exocrine insufficiency is the first in natural history, followed by development of diabetes, which is very last in the natural history of TCP or the FCPD.
Okay. Kunal, now the next question is LADA, latent autoimmune diabetes in adult. Where does it stand in the classification what we discussed?
So classification wise, it is just a type 1 diabetes only. So it is an autoimmune kind of etiology for a defective insulin production from the pancreatic cell. So and many of the authorities or many of the societies, they also deny to classify it as differently other than the type 1 diabetes, because it is just a late presentation of type 1 diabetes. And this late presentation has led to some of the pancreatic beta cells to survive for a few months to few years, and which is why in earlier years of LADA duration, they respond to oral drugs, or they may be normoglycin treatment. But otherwise, for me, it is just a type 1 diabetes only. So whenever we are diagnosing LADA or in a mild diabetes, if there is an autoimmune anti-GAD antibodies are positive and the phenotype is matching for that, so they should be treated with insulin only.
Okay. And the next question in the similar line, how do we identify and investigate LADA?
Okay.
Like clinically,
so,
what?
So LADA, so it will be confused with the type 2 diabetes only, because the age of onset will be around second or third decade. So late second decade or early third decade, maybe in the early fourth decade as well. So some of the patients may be at the cusp of overweight or obesity. And I had two patients in the last 1 year who had phenotypically, they have type 2 diabetes, which means they were obese and they had signs of insulin resistance also. But because they had presented for diabetic ketoacidosis, not severe ketoacidosis, but mild symptoms of diabetic ketoacidosis, and biochemistry is showing the high beta hydroxybutyrate, and that is why I had ordered an anti-GAD antibodies, and which had come positive. So it's a kind of mixed picture of type 2 or type 1 diabetes, but some of the clinical features such as the diabetic ketoacidosis that point to testing of the anti-GAD antibodies, and they are diagnosed as LADA.
Okay. One question is on steroid and diabetes. And here, at least before we go for that question, we should be very clear that there are two things. One is called steroid-induced hyperglycemia, and something is called steroid-induced diabetes. So both the way, one way we can just observe if it's not too high. So Kunal, what is your take on steroid-induced hyperglycemia and steroid-induced diabetes diagnosis and management? Like in COVID, let's take that we give dexamethasone to everyone.
Yeah.
So many patients are observed to have hyperglycemia. You might be getting call for that. So how will you deal with that? And second, steroid-induced diabetes. Like then how do you deal? One of the thing what we saw that the resistance is one of the mechanism there, but it can be multiple mechanism, not just resistance.
Yes.
Yeah.
So if we are dealing with the transient hyperglycemia because of the steroid injections, as we are seeing in the COVID pandemic, right? So again, it depends on the steroid sensitivity or an individual steroid sensitivity. Many of times you are seeing that despite on the significantly high doses of the methylprednisolone or hydrocortisone or dexamethasone, the hyperglycemia is not that very high and not even into the diagnostic category of diabetes. So this is an individual variability in the sensitivity to that particular glucocorticoid. Secondly, when it is a transient hyperglycemia because of the glucocorticoids, as in the COVID, the treatment of choice is only insulin. So then it depends that if you are using methylprednisolone, then methylprednisolone duration of action lasts for approximately 12 to 16 hours. Dexamethasone is a longer acting, its action lasts for 20 to 24 hours. So I prefer that whenever the patient is on methylprednisolone, if it is once daily, then I will put an injection of NPH insulin, that is neutral protamine hegdom, because the duration of action of both these match. NPH produces a peak of insulin action at around 6 to 8 hours, and the duration of action being 12 hours. So when we are giving methylprednisolone at 8 a.m. in the morning, for example, and at the same time, I would like to put an injection NPH, and when at the late night, when there is no extra steroid action, and then insulin action is also by that time insulin is also effect has been waned off. So there is no chances of late night hypoglycemias. When there is when the patient is on dexamethasone, then I would like to prefer the patient to be on insulin analogs such as insulin glargine or insulin degludec for longer acting mechanism of action. So for transient hyperglycemia, treatment of choice is only insulin. For steroid-induced diabetes, if the patient is on long-standing steroids, or if the patient is kind of a pre-diabetic patient and given even a minimal doses of steroid, they will turn into diabetes. So in these cases, there are clear guidelines also from some of the societies. For example, UK NICE Society. So they recommend that if the fasting glucose is less than 144 with the steroid and HbA1c is not that high, then you can just prefer lifestyle modification with diet and exercise, and that will usually take care of 80% of patients. If your fasting glucose is between 144 to 210, then you should be on other than lifestyle modification, you should be on oral drugs, for example either DPP4 inhibitors or sulfonylureas with or without metformin depending on insulin resistance. And if these patients are maintaining normoglycemia on these particular OADs plus diet and lifestyle, then continue on the same. And if they are not maintaining, then add on insulin. And if they, at baseline, if you are finding that fasting glucose is more than 220 or 250, then you should straight away start on insulin.
Okay. Okay. Fine. So the question in a way is, the mechanisms are more towards insulin resistance. So giving insulin, does it like really help? My thing is it is resistance, not refractoriness. So definitely it will help.
Yeah, always the resistance is not the absolute resistance in all the senses. So giving whatever resistance is there, if you are giving in a supraphysiologic amount, it is going to work. And if you are if you need rapid control of hyperglycemia, for example, in most of the COVID patients or in the indoor patients, so there is only way to combat that hyperglycemia is only and only insulin, because reducing insulin resistance with whatever drugs. So again, if you are using metformin or pioglitazone or whatever drugs to reduce insulin, it is also not going to produce the insulin resistance to below threshold level, because the glucocorticoids are very potent in producing insulin resistance, and that amount of insulin resistance will not be able to be reduced by a significant amount by drugs. So that is why the treatment of choice should be insulin when we want a rapid control of hyperglycemia.
Okay. And last question, which is quite surprising to come. What about, have you seen any IPEX syndrome or something where the type 1 or like what is the neonatal diabetes is still common?
IPEX
we have suspected many because we get reference. And one more thing I would like to add that in JIPMER at least endocrinologists refer all young diabetics or too young diabetes to us, because this autoimmunity and immunodeficiency are quite common. So that is
Yeah.
even Epstein is there, George is there, or this what we say IPEX, where diabetes is there. So sometimes they go to them, sometimes they come to us. But IPEX only thing what I actively look is two part. One is the skin lesions, which are quite eczematous. What cases have been described, I have heard in conference. I have not seen personally any case. And the second is the enteropathy. So if these two parts are there, I always keep actively looking for. If these two are the things strongly labeled as drug reaction and malnutrition, but that's the IPEX clue along with that. So what is your take on that? Have you seen any
That's
case?
actually a good point. Actually, I honestly I have not seen any case of IPEX. In one or the two cases in during my residency, we all collectively had suspected, as we had a weird thought of considering as an IPEX syndrome, but it was not confirmed. Neither it was taken further. Maybe because we did not have any rheumatology department in our institute.
Yeah. So I think that is a one area of immunology which is practiced in very few colleges, and it
Correct.
is good. It is something important to diagnose because there are treatments available, and centers are there for stem cell transplant. If you're a good hematologist, you can save that life for sure. So this is mostly like we will realize when we start doing the specialization, where we really get reference of pediatrics, and we are actually confused when we go in the first year and what to do. We really don't know anything, but slowly it comes over. So thank you, Kunal, for this amazing class and your all the inputs with query.